Good evening. Welcome. My name is Shun Basar, Director AACP here. First, boring bit of practicals. Can you please all turn your mobile phones off? Now, thank you. We've opened up the space here, so if people need to spill out, please do. Okay, this is the first of 3 talks on pop and populism that we're hosting over the next few weeks. I'm thrilled to welcome Momus this evening, and tomorrow we'll be hosting Jörg Heiser, who's the co-editor of Frieze magazine. Jörg will be talking about the contemporary art market and the debt that it might owe to Andy Warhol's factory. On Monday the 3rd of November, we have Sam Jacob of FAT, and Sam will be arguing for pop in architecture against the purifying plans of ascetic modernism. So before I introduce Momus, please let me say a few words about why I thought this would be an interesting and topical theme to invite our guests to talk about. On the one hand, it came about for a very simple reason, which is that there's a new Warhol show that has just opened at the Hayward Gallery this week. Without Warhol, arguably, pop art simply wouldn't have become what it is today. And nor would we have all experienced it without Warhol's inimitable and complex career, where he seemed to update Marcel Duchamp for the mass consumerist age. But rather than do something only on the merits or the failures of pop as an aesthetic category, I thought it would be interesting to set it against its kind of filial term, that is, populism. Whether it's the kind of audience democracy we see orgiastically packaged in the X Factor, or blockbuster exhibitions at heavyweight museums on Mario Testino or on Giorgio Armani, populism guides the will of democracies as much as it's the logic of old-school totalitarian regimes. According to the theorist Lars Bang Larsen, populism describes, quote, many present-day upheavals and crises that have their roots in the current crisis of the welfare state or the effects of globalization and neoliberal economies, allegedly in the name of the people. I think this is the really important phrase, in the name of the people. So, is it clear where pop ends and populism begins? Is there anything lost if we simply give in and surrender to populism? Or indeed, is there anything gained? So, I'd like to introduce our guest this evening. Generally speaking, I think it's a little gauche to be inappropriately sentimental in public, but I'm going to break that rule this evening. You see, Momus, who's also known as Nick Curry, or Nick Curry, who's also known as Momus, is, I believe, one of the most original and gifted singer-songwriters this country has ever produced. He's also one of the best lyricists, bar none. If you can get your hands on this fantastic book from 1992, which is called Lusts of a Moron, the lyrics of Momus, you'll begin to understand why. With a series of troubadour-like records in the 80s that included The Poison Boyfriend and Tender Pervert, Momus thrilled many in the pop firmament with his heady references to the Marquis de Sade, to T.S. Eliot, Nabokov, and Jacques Brel. The critic Jonathan Romney said of him that he's possibly the only truly subversive songwriter in Britain. Yet, Momus also annoyed many others, resulting in the infamous and unprecedented 0 out of 10 review given to his Hippopotamomus album by the NME. Since then, Momus has also slowly become Nick Curry again. As an intrepid cultural critic, he's been casting his eye over design, art, music, and of course, pop culture. He has 2 books coming out next year, one called The Book of Scotland and the other called The Book of Jokes. And he's even written, and we've just been discussing, how much he loves the AA as a kind of unashamed elitist institution. Proof, if we indeed need it, that Momus continues to have impeccable and maybe slightly wayward taste. So please give a warm welcome to Momus. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it does feel a bit like a homecoming, because I think as my critical powers got better while I was living in London, I could stand fewer and fewer places, and the AA was one of the places I could actually bear to come to, and in fact be really happy to come to go to the bookstore or the cafe. I hope my voice is going to hold out, because I've got a bit of a cold, and in the interview I was just doing with Shumon, it was there were some moments where I was spluttering and coughing, so we'll probably have some of those moments, and they will go on the historic record that's being made of this evening, and therefore will be handed down to posterity. But I guess it's kind of ironic and interesting that this lecture series would start with a pop singer, which is really what I am, and yet it would be someone who would be making a case mostly against popular culture, because I'm not a big fan. I'm a big fan of what popular culture does well within its own terms, which really, if I had to sum it up very briefly, I would say is to be able to balance novelty with a kind of with eternal truths that touch us all. So there's the new and the true, and the best pop culture manages to get that balance between the new and the true. But I think when pop culture starts to move into other areas, especially the laboratory areas, like the AA or like the ICA or whatever it is, galleries and other places which were formerly the preserve of high culture, so-called high culture, I think they need to be protected a little bit from pop music, and so, or pop culture in general. So I'm not a big fan anymore of Warhol. I went through my Warhol phase like everybody else, but I think it's not very interesting anymore to do this kind of appropriation of pop culture into other more elite cultural areas. So this is going to be an argument for elitism in a sense, or for a kind of protectionism of cultural spaces from popular culture. And it's interesting that Shumon, we've got the power cable coming in. Shumon made the connection with populism as a political force, which we've seen recently with the John McCain's selection of Sarah Palin. I guess this was the ultimate populist gesture. I think it's going to backfire. I think people, particularly in the current crisis, want a little bit more than a populist, something accessible and understandable in populist terms. But I think I see populism in entertainment and in politics as a way to seduce people and to get around their will by that seduction. And I think the will of the people is the essence of democracy, so you shouldn't really be doing that in politics. It's not very useful to get around the will of the people. So I think I want to talk about, the beginning of the lecture is going to be talking about this, the ways in which one's will is kind of bypassed by pop culture. So I want to start, really this is, it's not just, it's the title of the lecture is the ideology of the iconic, and but it's not, it's bigger than that, because it's really, the more I think about it, the more it turns into an examination of what postmodernism has meant, and particularly the relationship between postmodernism and popular culture, which is that we had the collapse of various binaries, which had been formerly fairly stable, the binary between here and there, which was collapsed in the postmodern period by globalization mostly, or the internet and things like that. There's no longer such a distance between here and there. Or you have the collapse between now and then, the past and the present are all mixed up, and we get this endless historical recycling. Yours and mine, another binary that postmodernism collapsed, appropriation, borrowing, quotation, all the rest of it, that's that binary. But also the high-low distinction. So popular culture, I guess really it starts with this book, Mythologies. Well, it starts for me. I would define postmodernism as beginning, as my personal definition, begins in 1956, 1957. And the pioneer of pop art is not Andy Warhol, it's Richard Hamilton. It happened in the Whitechapel Gallery in London. They had an exhibition called This Is Tomorrow in 1957. And it was Richard Hamilton, it was Rainer Banham, it was, I think the Smithsons were in that show as well. And it was called This Is Tomorrow. and it really was tomorrow. And we've been living that tomorrow for the last 50 years. And I think we've now, this week in fact, possibly this week or this month, we've turned a corner. And I think it's a very interesting time we're living in just now, because there seems to have been almost a magnetic pole reversal. A lot of things that were false 2 months ago are true now, and vice versa. So and we have this thing, Shimon alerted me to an interview he's just done with Nicolas Bourriaud, in which Bourriaud, who founded the Palais de Tokyo and came up with the term relational aesthetics, he's come up with a new term, which is the alter modern, which might be the term for the thing that comes after postmodernism. So that's another thing that I kind of want to think about today. What comes after, and what might it be like? And is pop culture going to play a part in it? So really the idea is that maybe postmodernism begins and ends with Purcell, because you have, in this book by Roland Barthes, Mythologies, you have an essay which is about Purcell Automatic, I think it was, the soap powder. And he's treating this soap powder as if it's a divinity which can purge your sins. And he's talking about the Purcell versus Omo, because the advertising of the time was very much these two powders, which were both produced by Unilever. And he's kind of seeing them as deities with amazing powers. You then come to the end of the postmodern period, and you have Victoria Beckham saying that when she's still a Spice Girl, saying that she wants to become as famous as Purcell Automatic. So you can see 50 years of Purcell. It's kind of, in a way, it's time we purged Purcell from our cultural system, and purged popular culture with it, possibly. Popular culture, fine in the popular culture zone, but it shouldn't necessarily invade the Whitechapel Gallery. That's really my thesis for today. So how does pop... You can read it all. Basically, I'm threading together a lot of things I've blogged about, because what I do compulsively when I'm not making pop music, which you can't make for more than a month or two in a year, is I blog and I sort of thread very intuitive observations together and link them with URLs and stuff. So this is all on my blog, Click Opera, which is a live journal, and including my lecture notes, as you can see. So how does popular culture undermine free will? I think there are various ways that it does that. The will of the creator is undermined by, I guess, by the glamour. I wrote an essay called Metaphysical Masochism of the Capitalist Creative, which was really just about, there's a kind of fundamental problem or paradox in the relationship between professional, say, designers, graphic designers, and the capitalist system, which is that capitalism doesn't value things for themselves. There's a great Brecht song that goes, "Don't ask me what rice is. I have no idea. All I know is its price." So in a way, that's the essence of capitalism. It's a trading system, an exchange system, but it's not a production system that really cares mostly about the quality, the texture. It certainly isn't into the... It has a fetishism of commodities, but it doesn't have the fetishism of materials that designers have, or that makers have, or in my essay I said the Japanese also had, because I think Japan is the country that I've noticed seems to care most about things for their own sake, possibly because of an animist tradition, the Shinto tradition, which says that there's a god living inside every object, and natural objects too. So, there is some weird charge that things have, which is a kind of divine fetishism that things have. Capitalism doesn't believe that at all. So you have the contradiction in every designer's life of the client doesn't give a damn. You somehow, for some reason, when you were a kid, when you were a designer, you became a graphic designer later, but you were tracing things out of magazines, or you were making things just because it seemed intensely glamorous to make things, to produce something out of nothing, and then to make it better than what existed already in the world. And yet somehow, when you get to the stage where you're having to work for a client, you realize the client has a totally different set of motivations, and it's about obviously making a profit and helping the shareholders, and it doesn't matter if the product is good or bad. I mean, if it's good and it sells, then fine. But so there is this somehow your will is undermined in the capitalist system if you're a designer and a maker, but also as a consumer. And again, there's a distinction between Japan and the West, I think. But as a consumer, we're taught to think in terms of guilty pleasures and of something else I've forgotten. Well, and actually, one way to get into that, what the consumer gets out of things, is through the word the iconic, which has become vastly overused cliche. And I was going to start the lecture actually with Kirsty Wark talking about the iconic, about Madonna as an iconic star. And Kirsty Wark said, it doesn't matter whether you love her or loathe her, you have to admit that you can't underestimate the impact she's had on music. And I'm very interested in that. It doesn't matter, because of course your subjective opinion, your subjective judgment is very important. We all judge what we like and what should be important to us, but it's almost as if there was an implication in that phrase that your subjectivity doesn't matter, and somehow it's not up to you. That when something is iconic, and this is the word iconic is attached to celebrity and marketing and all sorts of other things, but in a way it says it's out of your reach. Somebody has got attained a status now that is out of your reach. You can't write. Nobody has the power now to bring down Madonna. You can't write. There is no critic with the authority to bring down an iconic star like Madonna. There isn't, a Greenberg. I almost said Alan Greenspan. There isn't a Clement Greenberg anymore of pop music. And when I started in pop music, there was Paul Morley. And he could make or break. I guess people say that about Pitchfork a little bit now as well, that it can make or break artists. But there is no really one authoritative critical figure. So again, the iconic, I guess the iconic, it could be like a big agglutination of reputation and glamour that takes something to a different level, that takes it out of everybody's reach. And in a sense, it is already inscribed in history when it's iconic. And the iconic obviously goes back to the icon, and Madonna is the perfect icon because, of course, the original icons, Russian icons, Greek Orthodox icons, were often Madonnas as well. So, so when Kirsty Wark is talking about this icon, of course. So, oh yeah, I want to play you an audio file now, which is what happens when somebody tries to be an iconoclast. An iconoclast, of course, is a breaker of icons, and this is Front Row, BBC Radio 4's review programme last week, and it's John Wilson, who's a critic who was defending Oasis, by the way, on the Newsnight Review on Friday, the only person who was. And this is him interviewing Terence Davis, who doesn't like pop music very much. And you're not allowed to not like pop music very much, especially when you're representing the will of the people of Liverpool.
The film is dominated by your great love, Marla and Bruckner. There's a bit of John Tavener in there as well. Peggy Lee is almost as close as it comes to popular music, because you just don't like pop music, you hate rock and roll. The Beatles barely get a look in. In fact, we see them singing, but you've cut the Mersey beats over the top of them, which is almost heresy.
Well, because for two reasons. One, you can't get clearance on Beatles music. They charge a fortune, and I don't like them anyway. When Elvis Presley came on the scene, I can remember one of my sisters taking me to see him in Jailhouse Rock, and I was only 11, and I cringed. I thought, isn't he ridiculous? And this awful voice. And then the Beatles come along, and they're even worse. Money Can't Buy Me Love. Well, isn't that original?
In the film, you deliver with such a savagery, actually, the words yeah, 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 but you say yeah, 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 with such disdain. Now, your disdain for the Beatles leaves you as a dissenting voice in this city when John, George, Paul and Ringo are still revered as gods here. And this film was commissioned to reflect, the hopes and the memories of the people of Liverpool. Were you worried at the response that sort of view might elicit from the people here in Philharmonic Hall on Thursday night?
Well, yes, obviously, because, they are considered gods, but it wasn't commissioned to reflect the people of... It was commissioned to reflect mine. As I said all along, this is a personal essay. It's subjective, and If you don't want that, then don't give me the money, because I can't do that. I hate football. You know, Liverpool and Everton are not seen. It's seen en passant, because I just don't like sport. I cannot get worked up about it.
I read recently you were very scathing about the likes of Peter Kay and Steve Coogan and Ricky Gervais. You said that none of them had any talent between them.
No, I don't think they have. The real comic talent is when you may not have a particular funny line to say, but the audience are primed to laugh. Margaret Rutherford had it, Alistair Sim had it, Joyce Grenfell had it, Joan Greenwood had it. I recently showed Count Hearts and Coronets in Poland. As soon as she came on, there were ripples of laughter. She didn't speak. There's no one who can do that now.
But what's interesting about the three people, you know, Kay and Gervais and Coogan, they are all in their way quintessentially English comics. They're doing the same thing in a way that you are doing, which is mining that idea of memory and community and perception of English parochial life.
But for me, they do it so badly. It is, for me, not true. None of it's true. It's all false.
That's a good place to leave that. But I think this, I mean, just in the last week or so, I've noticed quite a lot of these iconoclastic views. I mean, it's interesting just from that, that he couldn't have worshipped at the shrine of the Beatles even had he wanted to, because as a filmmaker with a limited budget, he couldn't afford to license Beatles songs. So they're so much bigger than him, and yet he's attacked, really, the critic, I think, Wilson, is actually attacking him for not representing the will of the people. It's as if every artist has to acknowledge the icons, otherwise they're fair game. But I've noticed a kind of alternative movement, which is Peter Maxwell Davis, for instance, last week was saying similar things about was it the Beatles? I think it was the Beatles, and then it was someone else. No, it was some historian had said the Beatles were completely unimportant or uninteresting, and these things make headlines because it's iconoclasm. The archaeology of the term iconic is something that I actually was thinking about with... I blogged about it last week, and this guy, Dr. Stephen James, who's the senior lecturer in English at the University of Bristol, kind of came up with a rant, which I found very interesting, in which he agreed with my basic thesis, and then he said that he started thinking about when did he first start hearing this term iconic used in the current sense, and he thought about there was a show at the Royal Academy in 1998 called Russian Icons, and I think also let me find his rant. Your thesis in miniature seems to me spot on. I must admit that the compulsive modern media use of the term iconic, which I can't help but think of as a misuse, infuriates me. It also seems culturally symptomatic in complex and disheartening ways. I'm pretty sure the term started to be deployed in its new and to me still odd and jarring way circa 2000 to 2001. That's when my antennae picked up the word in TV and radio broadcasts and recoiled in revulsion. It was like the new word in the playground of the press that every dim person who wanted to sound smart instinctively understood they now had to use without actually understanding the word's previous applications. And it quickly spread like a contagion through the parlance of populism, not the parlance of the populace. Importantly, that's a distinction. Populism, the population, the populace, and populism, vox pop. There are shades of meaning between those terms which are good to bear in mind. Anyway, sometime around the turn of the millennium, thinks Dr. Stephen, the sense of an icon as a representation of a sacred figure was desecrated, so to speak, and set up for indistinct new purposes by a superbreed of Philistines. This all sounds a bit snobby, but I think there's a kind of elitism of populism as well, so it's really just one elitism against another. Stephen, what's his name? Dr. Stephen, as I'll call him, is not sure whether this was not something to do with the... Stephen James, he thought it was something to do with the millennium, that this began... I personally think it's something to do with the 80s as well, because in the 80s there was a sense of classic. The classic was a term that was used a lot for products, the Mac Classic. This meant that the product had become iconic, and it was rebadged as iconic. It was a self-consciousness on the part of Apple or whoever was making the product that this was an iconic, it was a design classic, like the Anglepoise lamp or or the Citroën Deux Chevaux or whatever it was, and it was in the design museum, and it was out on the street too, and you could drive the classic. So, wow, Dr. Stephen, as we're calling him, goes on here. There's also a sense that the people using the word iconic are actually contributing to the iconic status of the object that they're describing. So, and Newsnight, especially Newsnight Review, I'm going to sound very. I mean, they once approached me to be on Newsnight Review, but nothing ever came of it. So this is pure sour grapes. But I get a sense that they're almost saying something is iconic because you've heard of it before. You'll have heard of this before. We don't want to flood you with scary new information or anything too challenging. So just be aware that the next item we're featuring on the program is something you've vaguely heard of. It's iconic, and but it's a way to also obviously celebrity culture. It's about things that you recognize. It's recognition rather than cognition. Cognition would mean you'd see something new and you have to think about it. But recognition just means, oh yeah, we know her, or we know him, we know this band, whatever it is. So, oh my goodness. We've skipped way ahead to Paul Morley's interview with Brian Eno here from 1992, which I think of as the high watermark of postmodernist mannerism, really. Let's just watch the beginning of this, just to get the sense of what postmodernism led to at that point.
Meet my relations, all of them grinning like face pack. But, as always, what have we got on tonight's show? Steve, who have we got tonight?
Brian Eno, I believe.
Who the heck is Brian Eno? You know Brian Eno?
I think I know a tune by him.
Oh, go on then, if you must. You might have heard of Brian Eno because he was in Roxy Music. Or because in the late 70s and early 80s he made 4 albums that contained some of the most beautiful melodies of the last 500 years. You might know him because he wrote the theme tune for the Arena television programme, or because he produced David Bowie, Talking Heads, U2. Then again, you may never have heard of Brian Eno, never even heard of U2, David Bowie, whatever. Whether you've heard of him or haven't, love him or hate him. How about looking at the next 25 minutes as a profile of a man who makes a living, makes time, art, entertainment, adventure, out of being simply himself.
It's interesting, we get that formula again. It's a journalistic formula that always comes up when someone's being proposed as iconic, which is whether you love him or hate him, whether you've heard of him or haven't heard of him, he's there. He's sort of out of your reach. Your opinion doesn't matter. So again, it's this... I love Paul Morley. Paul Morley is a great critic. And he's even better now that he's not doing exclusively popular culture, I think. And that's maybe the message. Yes, again, it's this thing of being taken out of your reach. Here we get 2003 or 2004, this How Brands Become Icons, this book by, what's he called, Douglas B. Holt. And the publisher's blurb says, in this eye-opening book, Holt demonstrates that brands become icons not by highlighting unique features and benefits, but by staking out a provocative and valued position in the national culture. Iconic brands address acute cultural contradictions and the widespread desires and anxieties they create by performing myths. Now that analysis, that's interesting because he's saying it's not about utility, for instance. It's not about what can this product do for me. It's about the product getting into the unconscious of the culture and summing up some kind of anxiety or some kind of contradiction. It goes back to Vance Packard's book, The Hidden Persuaders, which comes early in the postmodern period. The idea of the depth psychology of advertising, the big car representing your anxiety about having a small penis and all the rest of it. And it's... Again, it gets around the utility value of products for you. Advertising is no longer about that. Building up a brand which is based on... Actually, I want to use the word incommensurabilities here. Not just based on anxieties and stresses, contradictions, paradoxes, tensions in the culture, but it's based on something incommensurable. And the brand somehow, the icon, smooths over that crack. So... it all ties together, the iconic and branding. This is something Slavoj Žižek said about. He's talking about something totally different, the financial meltdown. But again, he has this idea in the first paragraph here, this is the current London Review of Books site, that your will doesn't matter. One of the problems with the financial world has been that a lot of analysts were looking at market sentiment all the time, or consumer sentiment, and it kind of almost didn't matter what they thought the situation was. What mattered was how they could gauge what other people felt. And you begin to get a kind of derivatives, an emotional derivatives chain here, where people are thinking, what are other people thinking? How are they going to move on this? And eventually there's no sentiment at all. The market sentiment is simply my sentiment about your sentiment. Everything gets meta. And again, this is one of the great diseases of postmodernism, is the endless chains of meta. So read that. That's a good essay, by the way. So I think there's a crisis in criticism also, that people were doing a similar thing in criticism, that they were watching how the market was going to go, watching how the artist's reputation was going to go, and didn't want to stand up and be iconoclastic, especially not about iconic stars like even Jeff Koons or someone like that. It's very difficult for someone to stand up now. Have you read anybody standing up recently and saying Jeff Koons is appalling? No. Basically, he's got this iconic status now. Again, I love Jeff Koons. I wouldn't want someone to say he was appalling, but I think it's a symbol of our kind of fear, our cowering fear in front of the iconic. So one of my Freeze columns is about whether we can be genuinely rude in art criticism now. There is rude art criticism, but it tends to be sniping at smaller figures who can still be made or broken by critics, not by these really big iconic figures. So I guess in the middle of the postmodern period there was a certain optimism about what postmodernism could do, that it would be democratizing because you'd flatten everything. You'd flatten things taste-wise because suddenly popular culture is respectable. I remember that moment in the 90s when all the bourgeois people were going to football matches or kind of adopting loutish behavior. And there was a kind of sense that if you were too high above everybody, you could become lower, and if you were too low below everybody, you could. So it was a leveling, and there was a parallel leveling going on in digital culture in the same period, the 90s, and in terms of the globalization of world trade. Everything seemed to be like a leveling process, assuming there is the mythical level playing field in world trade, which there wasn't, unfortunately. Also, Clay Shirky wrote a fantastic piece debunking the idea that, my idea in fact, that in the future everybody would be famous for 15 people. I took Warhol's phrase about 15 minutes and turned it into 15 people because it seemed to be the model of, I guess, what Clay Shirky now would call the long tail, that 15 people read your blog and you're famous for those 15 people, and that is a democratization of fame. But Clay Shirky showed that, yes, there was that long tail, but there was also, because of what he calls power laws, there was also a big spike. So you get, everybody's reading Gawker and Boing Boing, and then that's a huge spike on the left-hand side of the chart, and then on the right-hand side, it's suddenly a long tail of lots of people, 15 people reading lots and lots of blogs all over the world. So it's like friends and family. But it doesn't do away with celebrities. I wrote an essay in 1991 called Pop Stars Nein Danke, which is really saying it's the end for celebrities, for pop stars, for these iconic figures. They're finished. The internet and digital culture, the cheapness of production of culture now with digital tools are going to finish these people. But it didn't. I mean, in a sense, it has, because digital distribution has kind of undermined the music industry, and will be doing the same with the film industry very shortly. But it hasn't totally. There are still stars, there are still celebrities, and in fact, it seems more than ever. So we haven't. Digital culture has not been iconoclastic inherently. And one thing you notice, I think, a lot of we pop singers used to be very bitter with our record labels and say we could have had big hits if the record label had just sent out strike forces to the record shops and all the rest of it and put a bit more money into promotion. But now what we see, we put a video up on YouTube And there is no record, there is no mediation at all there. There's no record company to blame. We see that it only got 20,000 views, and that someone else's video got 200,000 views, and it's totally open. So in a way, we have to blame ourselves for being marginal. And we have to then ask, did we optimize our marginality sufficiently? Like, if we knew that we were like poets, talking to a very small group of refined and intelligent people, perhaps we should have actually been poets. You know, perhaps we should have been doing something. And you know, in a sense, of course, if you've been on indie labels all your career, as I was, it was a bit like making poetry, putting out collections of poetry. You had a very small audience, and it was kind of on the fringes of popular culture, and it was energized by popular culture. But I think it essentially was like a high cultural form for a lot of, and I think there was a two-way energization that, you know, bands like My Bloody Valentine or whoever could energize the mainstream. With Nirvana, obviously, it went very big mainstream phenomenon so there was a mutual energization, which I don't think really happens anymore. I think now you have a fragmented mediascape where a lot of things are not talking to each other, and there is no center which can be energized by the peripheries. And this again is a part of what Nicolas Bourriaud calls the ultramodern, that it's a multipolar world. There's no longer an it and an other. There's just this kind of plethora, and hopefully it'll become a point-to-point kind of world where there's a lot of communication between those others, that everybody becomes an other, everybody just communicates with the other others, and there is no it. But I'm not sure how that's going to unfold. That's going to be very interesting to watch, because we don't at all live in that kind of world just now. We have, if you look at translation patterns between different languages, the Poles are not translating directly into Romanian. It's happening through hubs. It's a hub and spoke model, as they'd say in the airline industry. It's everything happens. Your national identity happens in relation to the other, to the Western it, rather, not to your next door neighbors. So there could be a nightmarish Freudian scenario of the narcissism of minor differences in this new landscape, where there's just a lot of sibling rivalry. And nobody really knows who they are anymore, because there's no definition in terms of a central hub anymore. I don't know. That'll be interesting to watch. What has postmodernism become? When should we? Another 20 minutes. Okay. Okay. So we're at the center of the postmodern, this 50-year nightmare from which we're now awaking, and. Well, I guess we all know what it's become. We don't really need to. This was a piece about the Beatles album, the remastered Beatles album George Martin made, where he basically took all the tapes and kind of just, almost like a Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein, he put all these dead bits of the Beatles back together in a new order. And I call this remasturbation, because it's remastering. And we were talking with Shumon earlier about all these bands. There's almost a sense of a necrophile tendency now, that bands who are dead effectively rise from the dead like Lazarus and go on the stage of the Queen Elizabeth Hall and perform in their entirety their albums. And as Paul Morley said on the on Friday's Newsnight Review, in the old days these bands would just have been dead, full stop. They just would have gone out in a couple of years. There was this constant, the novelty side of popular culture was healthy in those days, when the fashion basically kicked everybody out. I remember at Smash Hits, I was dating somebody who was a Smash Hits journalist in the 80s, and she said, "You're down the dumper." That was the term at Smash Hits. This band is down the dumper. But then of course, the band would be back. That was the other Smash Hits thing. Unfortunately, now we're living in the back period, where the bands just keep rising like, Night of the Living Dead. They keep coming back, and you can't kill them. Or else they just don't go away at all, like Oasis. 14 years into their career, they never seem to go away, and some people still think their Beatles parodies are good. I call this retro-necro. I was in Zavi this morning looking at the magazine rack, and every time I come back to Britain, I guess I kind of, because I don't come here that often, every time I come here it just kind of hits me in this way that perhaps people who live here don't get startled by. That I would say 80% of the music magazine covers were of defunct or dead artists, which again confirms Paul Morley's idea that rock music has really come to an end, precisely because it doesn't know how to forget anymore. I think you need to forget and to rewrite the rules, to keep a culture alive. And we've forgotten how to forget. And this is part of the retro-necro thing. Another part of the retro-necro problem is that you have a huge generational pull to the baby boomers, and that they have been the generation who basically bought pop culture. And you have the so-called 50 quid man who goes to Zavi, I guess, and spends 50 quid on a record, a CD of a vinyl record he bought in 1982 or whatever it is, and this is what financially keeps the mills of the popular industry, the music industry, certainly turning. But it's a necrophile tendency, basically. And also it's become, pop music has become an interpretative art. It's like classical music used to be. So people now interpret, whether they're actually interpreting their own albums from 20 years ago, playing them in their entirety, or whether they're simply doing kind of pastiche of another band who are iconic band like the Beatles. It's become interpretative, and it changes less quickly than classical music changed or changes. So it's become a tremendously conservative art form. Pop music, also films. I think films have a slightly younger audience. I think the financial aspects of the film industry are different in that apparently it's mostly kids in their teens and 20s who are paying into Hollywood. I don't know if that's still true, but it's not quite this 50 quid man middle-aged thing that pop music has become. Yeah, I read this thing. Julian Goch is someone I know in Berlin. He's an Irish writer who wrote something when David Foster Wallace died about... He unearthed a thing, a rather unkind thing he'd written about David Foster Wallace, saying that he shouldn't spend so much time and write so many footnotes about pop culture. This actually ties in with what one of the Nobel Literature Prize judges was saying last week, rather controversially, or 2 weeks ago, about he doesn't think American writers can really be taken seriously because they pay too much attention to their own popular culture. And that makes them provincial, and I think he had a point. He was savaged, not least by the fellow Nobel Committee members for saying that, but I think he had a point, because the thing about being the it culture, which the US has been, although I think that's changed and changing, is that you can be provincial and be global at the same time, because your references are going to be everybody's references, and the American pop culture in the postmodern period has been the culture of the entire globe. Obviously, with exceptions like Bollywood and even the Japanese music industry, some things have managed to be protected. Afropop, which is actually very trendy just now. Afropop is tremendously interesting to us because it's not been influenced by, not entirely true, because it's been influenced by rap music, but it's somehow been an enclave which is slightly protected from this global cultural flow of US culture. But that flow is global and provincial at the same time. But Julian Goch's statement was that it's like throwing stones at a prostitute. Why would you waste your time attacking pop culture? And I guess you would waste time. You would waste time if it was big in your windscreen. That's why you would. It's the only thing maybe that a certain generation of writers in the US had to write about. But again, it deprives the rest of us of that laboratory space that maybe high culture can be, because people reading David Foster Wallace are, intelligent people who have other things to think about. Somebody once said, an intellectual is someone who's found something more interesting to think about than sex. Yeah, we've done power laws. Yeah, oh God, this all ties in with the idea of Herbert Marcuse's idea of repressive sublimation, which I think is a beautiful idea. It's got an inherent instability. All these ideas, which like saying property is theft, you get into trouble quickly because you can't undefine property. The idea of theft has to include the idea of property, and therefore you start being like a dog chasing its tail when you say that property is theft. It doesn't really work. It's not a stable definition, but. Repressive desublimation is the idea that you put appetite you put Dionysus in the throne of Apollo, which is really what we've seen. We've seen popular culture used for social control increasingly. You go into a toilet in the airport and they're playing whatever it is, Bon Jovi, and it's kind of, it is not literally controlling your bowel movements, but it's somehow it's controlling your mood movements. I was in my hotel. They very kindly put me in the My Hotel just around the corner here, and somebody next door was listening to these awful power ballads and things on, I don't know, Capital Gold or whatever it is. Interesting, by the way, what anyway, the names of those radio stations, like Virgin FM, they keep changing them anyway. They're all changed, and you know, I'm, as a musician, maybe particularly susceptible to this, but maybe all of us are susceptible to mood control by music particularly, but also to the way we think about the world through popular culture. Everything during my lifetime was mediated to me through a backlot in Burbank. And if I go to Japan and watch TV in Japan, I'm kind of amazed how little there is of Burbank on Japanese TV. I mean, it's mostly studio guests in a Japanese studio speaking Japanese, making references that only Japanese will understand. I have a great envy, a cultural envy of that, because I was brought up in a country, Scotland, which mostly mediated the kind of essentials of experience. Friendship was Starsky and Hutch, you know. Danger was Red Indians, whatever it was. This was all mediated through American popular culture. And I feel that I'm deprived as a result of that. You know, there are other ways I could have learned about those essential things. So repressive desublimation is what happens. I guess it's the connection with populism again, and the political connection. It's what happens when you put Dionysus in the throne of Apollo. Some of us would like Apollo to be in his own throne. I think, in a way, I got a sense of that repressive desublimation when I was on a Virgin flight going to New York, and I think it was a birthday party, or it was Virgin Airlines' own birthday, their 20th anniversary or something. So like everybody was given little paper hats, and the hostesses were kind of giving us all little slices of cake with candles. We didn't have Richard Branson spraying champagne on us, thank God. But everybody was sort of honking away happily, and there was just a sense that, and yet at the same time there was an anxiety because this happened soon after the terrorist attacks, and there was a sense that there are people out there who are not having fun, who are not partying, and they're serious people. They're sort of shadows. They're serious people who wish harm on this hedonistic civilization that we've become, and that if they were on the plane, they would not be partying in this way. And when you get to the airport's been renamed the Airport of Enduring Liberty or whatever it is. You know, it used to be called Newark Airport, Liberty Freedom International Airport, and there's a sign saying the US is still open for business. Wow. You know, we're still open. But there's a sense that the dangerous people are the people who are not hedonists, and the safe people are the people who are being controlled with pop music and with popular culture. And Adam Curtis covers this territory very well in his Century of the Self documentary, which I'd recommend, and it's all available on the internet. The way, especially that the hippie movement, and even R.D. Laing and the figures who seemed like liberation figures in the 60s, this whole idea was turned into identity politics and a kind of the me generation, and then EST, and there was a repressive desublimation. There's a little section of the Curtis documentary which is about the Convent of the Immaculate Conception in Los Angeles, where Sister Corita, the artist, pop artist, who actually is like an interesting take on Andy Warhol, because she was making these almost Warhol-esque silkscreens which had kind of hippie mottos on them. And she was one of the nuns who took part in an experiment, a psychological experiment, where the nuns were allowed to express themselves, dress how they wanted, and they all ended up, according to Curtis and according to some accounts, they ended up lesbians. They were all having sex with the other nuns, and eventually they all left the convent. Sister Corita left the convent and became an artist, a very successful artist, and apparently she painted the world's largest painting, which is some oil tanks in Boston, and she put the profile of Ho Chi Minh on one of the oil apparently, it's one of these urban myths, but they had to repaint it, I think, because it was a big oil company. I think it was Standard Oil, and they didn't want Ho Chi Minh's profile. So that's what, you know, actually some of us now would like a return to some kind of, I mean, I think one of the interesting things about this alter-modern period is that it sees a sudden reaction against the last period. So there was anti-foundationalism before, and now we get an anti-foundationalism. There was postmodernism before, and now we get a postmodernism. There was before, what was the other one? yeah, perhaps there'll be a different kind of globalization as well. There's also a lot of, I've noticed, especially I think in the art, we should be finishing up, but I've noticed in the art world, just since Documenta 12, definitely a turn away from popular culture. Documenta 12, the fifth Berlin biennial, maybe the Yokohama biennial to some extent, there's been a kind of a very obvious turning of the back of the art world on, because I guess the art world is schizophrenic, because at the same time you have Basel. We'll see what the Frieze Art Fair is like in a couple of days, but I think that side will also, there'll be a new sobriety, perhaps even in that kind of bubble side of the art world. But definitely in the curated and institutional side of the art world, and certainly in Germany, there's been a real sense of not wanting media art or internet art, and certainly not wanting appropriationist art that delves into popular culture. So I was at a conference in Luxembourg in April at Mudam, organized by Candice Breitz, who's a South African artist who lives in Berlin, whose work has been about, for instance, people singing Michael Jackson songs or, dressing up as stars. And I think I was making the critique that is now not very interesting, and Candice herself actually said maybe it's generational. It's something generational it seemed very important as a democratization, or the death of the author means the birth of the reader and the consumer, but actually it's not. There is I think that we might see a return to the idea that there are public intellectuals or professionals, people who do things well, and that there's nothing shameful about doing things well. I personally really like the Dexter Sinister, for instance, who have there's a kind of playful didacticism about what they do, or Zach Keys, who's here tonight. A lot of people are working with this new, sorry, I pronounced your name wrong. Is it Kais? It's Kais, sorry, Zach Kais. I've noticed that, and I think a lot of the most interesting work has this kind of sobriety about it now. So, and that the popular culture that I'm personally finding interesting is stuff that's marginal and that is difficult, and that recaptures what the mainstream used to have, which was this formal innovation, the novel side, novelty side. So how do these distinctions look now? High, low, here, there, now, then, mine, theirs, sacred, profane. Perhaps there'll be a new idea of the sacred, that the iconic will not be mixed up with the profane. It was sexy for a while to have someone called Madonna, who was a bit like a saint and a bit like a sinner at the same time, but that idea comes to its end. An original copy, I think there's a return, now that digital culture has made everything infinitely copyable, for zero price, there's been a return to things which can't be reproduced and which exist in the real world, artworks which are physical, which are made of atoms, not bits. So that whole original copy thing has kind of also come to its end. So I think it's a very exciting time. I had dinner with a Japanese friend who makes very unpop music with bowls of water, with water dripping into them. And I asked her, why didn't you make pop music? I mean, what was it when you were younger that made you not be a pop musician? And she said, because I was a rebel. And I thought that's nice, because once upon a time when it started, popular culture would have been where the rebels went, or at least the people posing as rebels. Who knows? That was always was Elvis really that much more of a rebel than oh God, who's the terrible guy who was meant to be like a plastic Elvis? I mean, there's something I've talked about with Stephen Merritt a lot, that there's a kind of receding horizon of authenticity in pop music where there's always somebody behind the authentic figure who's even more authentic and therefore makes the authentic figure appear less so. And that's okay, and let's not go into the whole rockism thing of whether authenticity is desirable or not. But oh yeah, lots of Unpop. I just wrote this is another label I've come up with, Unpop. There's an album by Ishmaru, who's a Japanese outsider musician, a really real outsider musician, who's basically for the last 30 years made CDs at home in his bedroom in various places all over the world. So his new album's called Unpop, and I wrote an essay about that. And it's the idea that Simon Bookish, people Berlin, yeah. Berlin is perhaps the last subcultural city, although who knows? I mean, everything seems to have changed in the last couple of months. So London might be the new Berlin. There might be a lot of empty property around here and prices plunging. They've apparently property prices in London plunged 20% in the last 2 months or something. So it'll just be a matter of property will be free in London within a year. So at that point, you will really have a cultural laboratory situation here. It won't just be people in Hackney who are paying slightly cheaper rents. Everything will be totally free and squatted, and you can have a real cultural laboratory here. And at that point, I think all the kind of iconoclasts will become the new icons. So the ICA and the Architectural Association will be right up there, leading the whole new situation. So let's just call it a wrap there. Should we do questions, or is that not really done at these?
Perhaps while I ask you to maybe come up with a question or two, and if you do, put your hands up, and I'll give you the microphone. So perhaps I could ask you, Nick. I'm wondering, you got into the charts once, is that right? Yeah. 1991, what was it? 89, Hairstyle of the Devil, yeah, which is on YouTube, which I really recommend. And you were telling me earlier that it was, and if I do really recommend, could we play it?
Well, I mean,
the question is, I think it's very interesting because you said at that point you were almost trying, like the people who were really ruling the British charts, some of you weren't even born then. God, my God, we can say things like that now. Were a group of producers called Stock Aitken Waterman who produced early Kylie Minogue, Jason Donovan, Rick Astley, Never Gonna Give You Up, and your the hairstyle lifestyles of the rich and famous was a kind of, on your part anyway, sort of knowing riff or take on that incredibly almost. I mean, they called their outfit, what was it, the PW, but it's the Hits Factory. Hit Factory, which is also an interesting thing back to Warhol as well. But you said that something interesting. You said your take on trying to do Stock Aitken Waterman at the time sort of backfired. That there was no way of almost it was beyond appropriation or critique. And I'm wondering whether if you were to how would you start a career in pop today, or given that everything that you've just said, would you even begin a career in pop today?
Well, I think you'd begin it you'd begin it on the outskirts much more. Like the artist I like just now the most is maybe Orotaichi, who's like from the Osaka noise underground, and he makes very strange but very structured music. And I think there's a point to that. The old pop star thing, I think, is finished. I mean, I was thinking about writing songs for my niece, who's very cute, young teens, and if this were 20 years ago, somebody like that, you could sort of almost start molding them to become a pop star. But there's no point now, because what would you be doing it for? There's no Top of the Pops anymore. There's no all the stuff that seemed to matter then doesn't matter anymore. I think the medium has come to its end, and I think what people should be doing is optimizing their marginality. But it's not marginality anymore if there's no center. That's the problem. So I don't know how it's going to develop. But I think the problem that I faced was I was making these appropriationist interventions, which were a bit like what Candace Brights does in art, or countless people do in art, which is trying to make something that looks like a popular culture artifact, and pass it off in that industry as a pop song, but at the same time try to have a second level of it. Irony, whatever. The trouble is, irony is like it's a dog chasing its tail. It's the Ouroboros, which is the symbol of postmodernism. It's the snake eating its own tail. And how long can you enjoy the taste of your own tail, or the taste of somebody else's tail, which is even worse? If it's just the mainstream culture's ticks that you're parodying and pastiching. Satire and parody were the great traps of my early career. I think I wasted a lot of time pastiching when I could have been doing something more laboratory style. But then again, it was exciting to be working in the same medium that Michael Jackson was working in. At that time, it was exciting. And it was also exciting, the idea that you could become rich and famous, which I never did, but Jarvis Cocker did instead, and he tells me it's boring and terrible and rubbish.
Are there any questions? Maki-san? Vicky. You seem to be, basically you've made an argument for being a bit of a snob. But you can also see how there's a danger about, potential danger of simply, deciding to swing the pendulum the other way. So where does your snobbery differ from Terence Davis's, for example?
Well, it doesn't. I think Terence Davis is absolutely right. I think he's... I personally like the Beatles, and I like a lot of pop culture. I like the raw energy that, Mia's Paper Planes is a nice record, but at the same time, I think it goes back to the laboratory idea. And I think Robert Lowell said something interesting about poetry is like a laboratory, and not a lot of people pay attention to poetry, and yet maybe the things that happen in this laboratory of words being broken like eggs and an omelette being made, maybe something trickles, the yolk of the egg trickles down, something trickles down into that language is loosened up, everybody's language is somehow loosened up by a great poet. And I think that laboratory metaphor is what we should be focused on. It's not necessarily a snobism, it's more just the revival of the avant-garde, because the idea of the avant-garde, the cliche about the avant-garde now is that we invent something and 5 minutes later it's in a TV commercial, blah, blah, blah. I don't think that's true. I don't think that's ever been true. There are lots of things you can't say and do and pastiche in a TV commercial. Yes, some ideas were ready for that, and especially in a city like London, which became very much about the synergies between the commercial culture and the art culture. There was a collusion there. But in other cities, it's not been the case. I think Berlin has not been attuned to commerce and culture, commercial culture in the same way. So I would just argue for there being more of a separation between the pop culture mainstream. I keep using that word mainstream, but I kind of hope the mainstream is finished, but it probably isn't. And this laboratory culture.
And just a little bit on this. I find it interesting and maybe provocative that you still cling to the idea that the avant-garde might still exist. I'm of the ilk that's kind of given up on it. At the same time, do you then believe that there is still such a thing as cultural radicality, as subversion, or, as some others may have said, that's something that's only in the preserve of the terrorist today?
Well, it's interesting. There is a kind of convergence between terrorism and, for instance, pervasive urban gaming. I was involved in this thing called the, what was it called? There was a pervasive urban gaming festival earlier this year. In fact, the guy who organized it, Alex Fleetwood, is currently making an environment where you kind of, you're communicating with people by telecoms, and you're, I don't know how it's done, but it's like a house where somebody died and you have to relive this man's last moments. There are all sorts of new initiatives which are turning cities into playgrounds, and which actually resemble terrorism a great deal, because it's like flash mobbing and all the rest of it. And that's an interesting idea of, because we've had reality TV, which purports to be turning spontaneous events into mainstream entertainment, but pervasive urban gaming is very different, and it's about turning the whole city into a kind of reality spectacle, because it is reality. It's not mediated. It's an organized reality. So I think we'll see more of that, and possibly a taming of terrorism, or a kind of subversivization of pervasive urban gaming. That could be interesting.
Hello, great talk, thank you. You mentioned at the top of your talk, this is tomorrow, and been very interested recently by another Scottish blogger, Charles Stross, who's a science fiction writer, saying that it's absolutely impossible at the moment to write about the near future, or even the mid-future. And so I was wondering what that would mean for somebody curating, or someone in your new avant-garde. How would they explore how would they stage a cultural laboratory when somebody's in one of the crucibles of the science fiction writing, in my point of view, it's saying it's kind of, you have to just completely, there are too many black swans, if you like, to kind of have a zoo or something. I don't know.
That's, yeah, good question. And Moscow Magazine just asked me to write what I thought would happen in 2015, which is just 7 years away. And I found that very difficult because it's not far enough away to be for anything to go, because in the future just about everything that can happen will happen. But it's not close enough either to be really predictable from the tea leaves. So, but I thought back to 2001 and what was different between then and now. But my technique, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the Black Swan, because I'm writing a book just now called The Book of Scotlands, which is kind of trying to brainstorm parallel Scotlands. And it's a numbered list of 1,000 Scotlands. And it's talking about what a future independent Scotland might be like by talking about what it won't be like. So I'm trying to do it only by negatives. And really, each piece works by really... a lot of the pieces are talking about other countries like America or Japan, but I'm changing the name of the country and just saying Scotland. And just that one change can really evoke a whole... It brings into existence in your imagination a whole new idea of what a Scotland might be like, a Scotland that was like Japan. So I think this kind of, the idea of the lie, every lie bringing into existence a parallel world in which that lie is the truth. That's one way we can think about the future. It's a series of parallel worlds that we could that are at the moment lies. I mean, it's very interesting. We're living through a period now where things that were lies 2 months ago are truths now. And it's almost like the Shakespearean fool was right, or the reggae record that said Babylon Afal, it was right. And the financial companies should have got those guys in as consultants, you know, because it's things that seemed crazy, you know, that you're crazy to waste your money paying rent instead of having a mortgage. You know, that was crazy a few months ago. It's not crazy anymore. So I think it's really interesting, this polarity switch we've lived through, and it does demonstrate the virtue of a certain kind of delirious thinking. I would very much be in favor of delirious, crazy thinking, because the future is going to be more extreme probably than we imagine. We need to be delirious.
So it's about width, in a way.
It's about not saying what it will be, but saying what it might be, and the parallel worlds, and our ideas about those parallel ones. Some of them are horrific. I mean, half of my Scotlands are horrific. In one of them there's like 6 giant babies which roll about Scotland like a billiard table and splash into the sea and bounce into each other, and then they eventually eat all the oil rigs. And I mean, some of it's actually quite... I just saw the installation at Tate Modern today, the Dominique Gonzalez-Forster exhibition, which kind of is very topical because it shows a kind of a delirious idea of a kind of disaster-stricken London in 2058. And that's the kind of thinking I mean, it's a little bit spectacular, a little bit over the top and spectacular, perhaps. I might have preferred something quieter, more part of this new sobriety I was talking about. But I think it's delirious parallel world thinking.
Okay, my last question. Girls Aloud or Keen?
I just was going to mention Keen, actually, because Keen are part of this treacherous new... well, we're just basically doing... colour by numbers, join up the dots versions of David Bowie, like the tracks I heard from their new album. I hadn't actually heard Girls Aloud. I think I went to school... no, I didn't go to school with them. What am I talking about?
In a parallel reality, you probably did. Nick Curry, also known as Momus, also known as Nick Curry, thank you very, very much for coming to the A.